Have dinosaurs, humans, and mammoths been found in the same fossil layer together? Maybe. So I found some evidence that there has been a dinosaur found with a human and with animals such as a mammoth. And the evidence, I would say, is weak enough that I wouldn't have made a video, except that someone asked me if there's ever been a mammoth found with a dinosaur. And so, because the evidence is strong enough that it might be true, I wanted to go ahead and make this video. And someone else, the way I found out about this, actually, somebody had come on my stream. Matthew came on my stream and asked me if a mammoth had ever been found with a dinosaur. And I said no at the time. Well, I said I'll give you the point on that at the time. But afterward, I remembered that my young Earth creation buddy, Matt, Raw Matt, if you guys know him, he had previously sent me a video that he made on this topic. And that video is linked in the description. And it's a condensed version of what I'm about to give you. And I'll give a little bit more than what he went into in his video. So if you want a condensed good video on this, you can go to his video linked in the description. But I wanted to slow it down because I really wanted to talk about the evidence and weigh it out and see, like, what is good evidence, what might not be such good evidence. And then there is also what I think is some evidence against. So let's just start with the evidence. And our first piece of evidence starts with a guy named Francis Holmes. And he spent a lot of time. I'm sorry, I should have introduced, where was this possible dinosaur and mammoth and human found together? It was in the Ashley Phosphate Beds in South Carolina in the mid 1800s. And so the first person who really, well, I don't know if he's the first person, but he is someone who wrote about this extensively. This is Francis S. Holmes. And so he lived from 1815 to 1882. He was a pretty prominent person in this field. He was a professional professor of natural history at the College of Charleston. He was also the curator of the Museum of Natural History. And he was just known as one of the leading paleontologists of his time. He wrote numerous books on these topics, especially with the Ashley Phosphate Beds, and also about agriculture. So he's a pretty good source of information. But the first piece of evidence that I want to give you is evidence against the dinosaur and mammoth being found together. And that is in his book published in 1860. In 1860, he published this. It was Post-Pliocene Fossils of South Carolina. And in this, he talks about the Ashley Phosphate Beds. In fact, that's really what the book is about, his findings there. Now, one thing something about this book is that he never mentions in this entire book anything about finding a human fossil in the Ashley Phosphate Beds. He also never mentions anywhere in this book finding dinosaur fossils. And so, and basically this book describes all the fossils that he found there. Like, he goes through and in depth talks about each fossil, describes the fossil. And among the fossils in this book, there is no dinosaur and there's no human fossils. Okay, so this is, I would call that evidence against. But one thing that was interesting in here is that he did mention that they had discovered a fragment of Indian pottery associated with the bones. And so that's just the one human artifact that was described in this. What's interesting for me as I was reading this book is that I didn't realize how already the uniformitarian stuff was so widely believed at that time. And so here he's describing the layered formations that were popularized by Charles Lyell. And so he's going on to describe the layers. And then here, this does mention, this is kind of part of the introduction of the book. And he's just kind of putting some letters that have been written about this. And this is from somebody who was pretty well known at the time, Professor Leedy. And so this is what Professor Leedy wrote about Holmes's discovery. He said he submitted for my examination a collection of fossil bones from a post-Pliocene deposit on the Ashley River, South Carolina. Among remains of the extinct horse, the peccary, Mylodon, Megatherium, Mastodon, Hipparion, tapir, capybara, the beaver, muskrat, etc., were some which I considered as belonging to the dog, domestic ox, the sheep, and the hog. Now, so basically, Professor, let me just go on and read a little more. I'm sorry if this is boring, but I do want to talk about it as much as possible so people can really see the evidence. So he says, Professor Holmes observes that these remains were taken from an extensive deposit in which similar ones exist abundantly. And he further adds that he cannot conceive that the latter should have become mingled with the former since the introduction of domestic animals into America by the Europeans. It is not improbable that the American continent once had as part of its fauna representatives of our domestic animals, which subsequently became extinct, although I'm inclined to doubt it. But what we have learned of the extinct American horse will lead me to carefully investigate the subject. So a lot of the things that were discussed about these phosphate beds, there was already a pretty big, this was a pretty big discovery, even if we leave out the dinosaur and the human bones. Okay, so this was talked about a lot at that time. And so the next source of information I'm going to give you, I consider this sort of a neutral piece of evidence. It could be slightly in favor of, the whole story, or it could be evidence against also. And that is this discussion from, this is the Proceedings of the Academy of Natural Sciences of Philadelphia. They met on May 9th. There were 26 members present. And so they started talking about the Ashley Phosphate Beds. And they said, Professor Leedy observed that the so-called phosphate beds of Ashley River, South Carolina, were remarkable for the singular admixture of multitudes of fossils of different ages from the early tertiary period, inclusive down to the present epoch. So this I consider sort of a neutral piece of evidence because it does show that people were really talking about this and that a lot of fossils were found here. They were from different periods, all the way, from the tertiary period to the present epoch. And so there, but again, it could be evidence against because it doesn't mention anything about a dinosaur or a human being found in these fossil beds. But it does actually mention tools. So along with all the animals that it mentions, including, lots of basically sea animals and also land animals, it talks about the rude implements of our more immediate ancestors. So basically they found tools as well. And so they admit that here. And so that's interesting because that does go along more with Holmes's next book that he published on this. And this is the book where he does bring up, and he specifically says that in that same layer that he found all of those other animals, they found a hadrosaur. Okay, so this is the cover of his book, and it's got a hadrosaur on it, and a person as well. But so and he even writes below that it's a hadrosaur. Okay, let me see if I can make this bigger. Well, you can zoom in on it, but it's the phosphate rocks of South Carolina, their history and development. So what's interesting about this, so this is the book where Holmes mentions the dinosaur and the human. Now, this book was published in 1870. What I find interesting about this, and this is why I think this is good evidence for, I mean, it's the same person and he's documenting this, but guess what? He retired in 1868. And so that gives me a little clue that maybe since he retired, he had a little more freedom to publish what he wanted to publish about this. Because as I mentioned, all of the documents that I was reading from that time period, it was very clear that they had already established these are the geological layers, and they didn't want to find, this probably weren't liking the idea of finding this discovery. If that's true, okay, it could not be true. But then we'd have to say, well, then Holmes decided after a long career of, great work, he suddenly retired and then he just decided to lie. Okay, so I think this is a good piece of evidence in favor of actually finding a hadrosaur and other dinosaurs that we'll mention here in a minute. So this is what he writes in this book. So the first mention of it, well, I'm giving you a little background as we're reading. This is the page before he makes the biggest statement. Okay, but he's talking about, basically he's kind of talking about the strata, like he's talking about different parts of it. And first he starts out talking about, I found sharks, we found coral, fish, whale-like, alligator-like animals, such alone as live in the sea, but no remains of any land animal have ever yet been found in it. He's talking about the marl bed. Okay, so there's one layer that's kind of different than all the layer above. And so I'll show you the drawings he put in the book in a minute. But then he talks about the layers where the land animals are. He says all the remains of the land animals obtained in such vast numbers are mingled with and not embedded in the nodules found in the phosphate basins. And this mingling of bones and teeth occurred in the post-Pliocene age. Post-Pliocene is like after 5 million years. Let me make sure I'm getting my dates wrong. Okay, the Pliocene would be 5 million to 2 million years. So post-Pliocene would be 2 million years to present. Okay, so he's saying that that's where they found all of these bones of the land animals. And he says it was in this post-Pliocene age. So after, from 2 million years to present, the period in which the American elephant or mammoth, the mastodon, rhinoceros, megatherium, hadrosaurus, and other gigantic quadrupeds roamed the Carolina forests and repaired periodically to these salt lakes or lagoons, or as they are called in Kentucky, salt licks. Okay, so this is, where he mentions the hadrosaurs. Okay, and so that being found. And here's his drawings. There's a lot of there's several drawings in this book. I only put in 2 of them. And I'm not going to really go into talking about the geology because honestly, I could not make heads or tails of it. Not just because of his descriptions, but other people have different descriptions, and then even today people are arguing about these layers and stuff. So I just put his drawings in here, but I'm not going to go into talking about the geology. And so uh, um, then he goes into talking about how they found the stone arrowheads and a stone hatchet in the same bed of that post-Pliocene age. And I'm going to read this part because I think it's pretty interesting. So it says it was on the 23rd or 24th day of February 1844, whilst engaged in the removal of the upper beds covering the marl and preparing for the opening the large pit just alluded to, the laborers discovered among the rocks several stone arrowheads and one stone hatchet. They were found directly under the roots of a large oak tree, which was cut down and its roots removed to make way for our marling operations. The tree stood just within the margin of the high land skirting the marsh. The pit, as laid out, encroached upon. I can't read this because it's blocking on my thing. But okay, we skip one sentence because I can't read it because, like, on my thing, it's showing a little slide 15. But going on, the well-known similar forms obtained from the Indian mounds of America and attributed to the handiwork of its aborigines. But when under the oak at the marl pit, among the marl rocks, as they were then termed, and very properly too, for they are indeed the marl rocks derived from the mother bed of the Eocene marl. Every precaution was immediately taken to satisfy ourselves to the possibility of their being the same age as the mound arrowheads and hatchets, but just washed into a gully in after ages found mixed with the marl rocks. Okay, so he's saying they they took into consideration that these artifacts could just be washed, into this bed and not actually belong there. Okay, so now, and no more of such relics hereafter be found okay, so did I skip a page? I must have skipped a page. Okay, oh, here we go. After careful study of everything connected with their discovery, the place and stratum in which they were found, their remarkable forms, we were satisfied that they belonged to and were deposited in the same geological age to which the bones and teeth of the mastodon, elephant, rhinoceros, horse, and other land animals belong, and which are found associated with them in the same matrix or mother bed of clay, which is of the post-Pliocene period, and which we have since designated as the prehistoric age of man. Alas, for young students and their beautiful theories, Professor Toomey, about this time, visited the locality, examined the specimens and everything connected with their discovery and exhumation, together with all the surrounding strata, and advised against their publication, as it was possible for them to have fallen into a hole at the foot of the tree, or the buried burrows of some animal, and should no more of such relics hereafter be found, our reputation as observers in the geological field would be affected. It was good advice, and we took it, though we certainly were convinced against our will. Night after night, we studied and talked over these arrowheads and this stone hatchet. So this is interesting to me because it kind of gives us an idea about what they were thinking. So they found the arrowheads, they found the hatchet. They really believed it was in the same layer, but just in case it wasn't, they did not want to take the chance of ruining their reputation. And so, he agreed that was good advice. Just don't report it. And so they didn't end up reporting that right away. So that gives us one clue that Holmes is now writing this a little more freely than maybe his book in 1860, even though they did mention the pottery in that. So I'm not sure what made them more confident about that. But anyway, it gives us some insight into what he was thinking. So then he talks about how they discovered human bones not very long after finding the above named relics of human workmanship. And while engaged in our usual visits to the Ashley bed, a bone was found projecting out from the bluff immediately in contact with the surface of the stony stratum, the phosphate rocks. We pulled it out, and behold, a human bone. Without hesitation, it was condemned, and as an accidental occupant of quarters to which it had no right geologically, and so we threw it into the river. Alas, we have lived to regret our temerity and rashness. A year after, a lower jawbone with teeth was taken from the same bed, and we now have that in the cabinet. Subsequent events and discoveries show conclusively that the first discovered human bone was in place, and that the beds of the post-Pliocene, not only in the Ashley, but in France. And he down below, he says Professor Kerr and Dr. Pratt in 1867 discovered other human bones, parts of a femur and a tibia in the same bed and from the same locality. These are also in our cabinet in Charleston. Now, I couldn't really verify this discovery, but I did verify that Dr. Pratt was someone who was working on the Ashley Phosphate Beds. So, we can just take it or leave it. But yeah, that's basically all that I put for this book. I do think this is a pretty interesting book. I didn't read the whole thing yet, but I might finish it because I read a good portion of it, and it was very, yeah, like I said, very interesting. Now, that is our evidence from Francis Holmes. And so you can, decide what you want to do with it. His book in 1860 did not mention this at all, except the only human artifact he mentioned was the pottery. It didn't mention human bones. It didn't mention dinosaurs. Then he retires in 1868, and then he publishes this book in 1870, and it's got the stuff about the hadrosaur and the human bones, and the artifacts, the hatchet and the arrowheads. Now, do remember that when they talked about this on May 9th in Philadelphia at the Natural Sciences Conference, they did say that there were tools found. So that may have been eventually reported. Okay. So here's our second piece of evidence. And this one is stronger in one way and weaker in another. And what do I mean by that? This guy is John Christian Keener, and he was an Episcopal minister, and he was also a really staunch creationist. And so he talks about the discoveries in the Ashley Phosphate Beds. So his book is called The Garden of Eden and the Flood. And believe me, this is like, I wouldn't be surprised if a creationist today was writing this. As I was reading it, I was like, wow, this guy's a, creationist just like today. He is really trying to persuade people that evolution is not true and that there's not good evidence for it. And he's trying to show evidence of the creation. So in that way, it makes him a very biased witness. So in that way, his evidence is actually a little bit weakened because, of course, he's got a bias. And so not that people who have a bias aren't, they might be totally honest, and he may be completely honest. It's just that his bias weakens his testimony a little bit. So, but let's just see, because in that way it's weaker, but it's actually, I think, a stronger piece of evidence for the fossils being found together, the dinosaurs, the mammoths, and, well, he doesn't mention the human fossils, so I don't think. Let's see. So this is, I just kind of put the whole page here, but I'll just highlight this part that he says. The remains of the hog, okay, and he talks about this in deposits of the post-tertiary age, remains of the hog, the horse, and other animals of recent date. Oh, he does mention the human bones. Together with human bones, mingled with the bones of the mastodon and giant extinct lizards. Now, in here's this his same book, and this is, I think, the strongest piece of evidence because he gives the a list of fossils from someone's collection. And I looked into this. So he says the following fossils with the phosphate nodules and boulders, I don't know, from the beds of the Ashley were on exhibition in the South Carolina Department of the New Orleans Exposition of 1884 from the collection of Major E. Willis of Charleston. Now, this is really interesting. I looked this up, and it is true that there was this exposition that happened. So the location, the event that he mentions is real, and the collection of Major E. Willis, the fossil collection of Major E. Willis, is also looks like it's real, and I'll talk about that a little bit after we talk about what was in his collection that was on exhibit. Okay, so I highlighted the relevant ones, but you'll see there's lots of animals mentioned here, lots of modern animals, sea creatures, different things. But the important ones for us, the teeth of the mastodon, vertebrae of the mastodon, bones of the mastodon, coprolites of the ichthyosaurus. Okay, so we've got an ichthyosaurus. He says teeth of ichthyosaurus, teeth of plesiosaurus, bones of iguanodon. I can't tell if I'm reading this correctly. Yeah, I can. Okay, and bones of hadrosaurus. Okay, so he mentions the hadrosaurus also. Okay, so this is, to me, the best evidence for this, even though it's coming from a creationist source, but it looks like he's well documented where he saw it. And it looks like this guy, Major Willis, did have this fossil collection, and I'll show you why. Now, I couldn't find a picture of Major Willis, but what I found is really interesting. So I did find his tombstone, and it turns out he was a major in the Confederate Army. So that's his tombstone. But there's a bunch of archived papers from him. And I wasn't even trying to look up any connection to the fossils or anything like that, or the phosphate beds when I looked him up. I was just trying to find out who he was. And what was interesting is it automatically, like, this is what it came back with. These are like little pieces of things that he had that are still kept, chiefly correspondence and newspaper clippings regarding phosphate industry and railroads in South Carolina during the Civil War and Reconstruction eras, and the iron industry in the South after the Civil War. So he was somehow involved caring about the phosphate beds there. So you can see this. There was a letter found where somebody from Yale College had written to him. And it was a letter that was basically written to Willis regarding a collection of fossils sent by Willis to the Yale Museum, and sending a photo of a mastodon. And so, and then it also has, a collection of statistics on phosphate rock production. Okay, so this to me looks like Willis did have a fossil collection, and he actually seems like he sent the fossil collection and gave it to Yale. So that's really interesting piece of evidence. So the next thing that's in that book, so he writes, okay, hold on. I'm going to have to make this bigger. Thanks for being here, guys, by the way. I'm having a great time with this. This is like really fun. Okay, I'm gonna have to just make this bigger. Let's see if I can do that. Okay, now I gotta move myself, or I'll just take me off for a minute. Okay, so he mentions the mastodon, the tiger, the elephant, and all of those animals live in the neighborhood of man, and also the coprolite of the ichthyosaurus. When Agassiz came to Charleston in 1853, and that's another, Agassiz was another one of the important people in the natural sciences at that time. Okay, and so it says, and it was handed to him a tray full of horses' teeth. He spent the entire night on the floor examining them and exclaimed to Professor Holmes, "These old bones have set me crazy. They have destroyed the work of a lifetime." So, what does he mean, destroyed the work of a lifetime? Now, in the context of this creationist book, it sounds like it's destroying the idea of evolution. At least that's what he wants us to believe. Okay, so of course we recognize this is a biased source. So he says, "Now, gentlemen and brethren, take these facts home with you. Get down and look at them. This is the watch that was under the steam hammer, the doctrine of evolution. And the steam hammer is the wonderful deposits of the Ashley beds. There's nothing in evolution, nothing in the Darwinian theory. If you take the time out of it, when you put the megatherium and beaver together, the ichthyosaurus and the horse together, for they are found together, there they died together, there they sleep together, there they live together. It is evident they were created together. I say it takes the time out of evolution and knocks the higher criticism where the watch would have been if the steam hammer had come down upon it." I love this. I love this creationist. Man, he's cool. So, anyway, he obviously thinks this is good evidence against evolution. Now, I found one other thing that I thought was a good piece of evidence that lends credibility to the idea that hadrosaurs were found in those phosphate beds. And here it is. Hadrosaurs have later been found, or at least parts of hadrosaurs, teeth of hadrosaurs are believed to have, I mean, they have been found. Here's a book that talks about the findings of, hadrosaur bones in South Carolina. And so what's interesting to me is that these hadrosaur teeth were discovered in South Carolina in 1986. So before that, we really, if we basically, this is a little bit of evidence that gives credibility to what Holmes and the others reported, and Keener reported, because by the time that Holmes wrote his book in 1870, there were 57 different types of dinosaurs that had been identified, and between 20 and 30 genera of dinosaurs. So hadrosaur is one of 20 or 30 that could have been identified by him. And he identified that as a hadrosaur. Now, hadrosaurs, we didn't, other than his report, until we found those hadrosaur teeth and other hadrosaur, whatever they've found that's in that book, which I haven't read, we wouldn't know that hadrosaurs lived in South Carolina, right? So that kind of lends credibility that we later, 100 years later, found out that hadrosaurs did live in that area. So to me, that does lend credibility to his story. And that really concludes my evidence for the mammoth, dinosaur, and human being found together. And you can take it or leave it. Like I said, I probably wouldn't have made a video on this if someone hadn't asked me specifically. because I would prefer to make videos that about things that I'm absolutely certain about, that I know I'm giving true information about. And but as I was looking at this, I started really like thinking like this evidence is strong enough that it should be shared. And Matthew should know that it's very possible that we have indeed found dinosaur, human, and mammoth, and a lot of other animals together in the same bed. So, in the same layer. So, thanks for watching. And I hope this was helpful to you. I've put some of the some of the sources I used in the description of the video. I didn't have links to the actual books, but they weren't that hard to get. And if you actually want to read those books, I have the entire PDF of those books at, in on my computer. So if you email me, I will email you those books, make it easy for you. So thanks for watching, and I hope this was helpful. Take care.